Okay, finally ready to begin again here in the book of Luke. It's been a week or two since I got around to starting this in Luke 1. It's taken a while for me to get back to this. Now, I'm going to be in, this is a Monday, June 17th, 2024, right about 12:30 p.m. I'm hoping to get some significant progress made in these Luke videos today because I am finally going to be in all week this week with no distractions and nothing else going on. So I'm hoping to make progress. I did Luke 1 a week or two ago, and now I'm finally ready to begin with Luke 2. This is about Jesus. We read about Jesus. We read about John the Baptist's birth in Luke 1 and about the announcement of Jesus' upcoming birth. Now we're going to read about Jesus' birth and the events, some of the events of his childhood. This, of course, is the Christmas story. I'm exactly a half a year away from Christmas. I'm not going to wait for Christmas in order to read Luke 2 here. This is unique. This material here is unique to the Gospel of Luke. We don't have this information recorded anywhere else in the New Testament. Because of that, I am going to go back to the Old Testament and read some passages that serve as anchor points for the material here in this passage. I said when I started this Luke series, this Luke video, that I'm not going to be doing as much Old Testament quoting as I read through Luke as I did when I read through Matthew or Mark. Two primary reasons for that. One is that a lot of the material in Luke is already in Matthew and Mark, and I already did that when I read those Gospels. So the material that Luke repeats from those Gospels, I'm not going to cover them quite as much in depth as I did when I did those Gospels. And secondly, because Luke himself, for the most part, does not directly quote the Old Testament or dig deep into the allusions that he's making. Now, he will make lots of them. He already has. When we read Luke 1, for example, and we read those songs he had Mary and Zechariah sing, I mean, those are straight from the Old Testament. The language used in those songs is straight from the Old Testament. And if we really wanted to, we could go through and kind of find allusions in practically every verse. But we're not going to do that, okay? It takes forever to do that, for one thing. And Luke himself doesn't really do that. He doesn't really draw attention to these Old Testament allusions he's making. He's kind of letting that, he's forming those connections narratively, but he's kind of letting that stay somewhat on the periphery or in the background so that the savvy reader will be aware of it, but that he's not distracting from his actual account by constantly going back to the Old Testament. But he is certainly aware of the Old Testament, and he is putting out just allusion after allusion after allusion to the Old Testament. Now, in this chapter, there's a lot of unique, this is entirely unique material. Like, none of this stuff is in any of the other Gospels. And some of it does kind of need to be explained somewhat about, why the characters are doing some of these things. So we are going to go back and look at the Old Testament today as we go through this chapter. Luke 2, this is the Christmas story. Whether you're a Christian or not, if you've been living in the Western world in the last several centuries, you're probably familiar with this. In those days, so in the days of John the John the Baptist's birth, if you just got done talking about. So in that time, now remember, Luke is writing about 60 years after these events have happened. He's writing in about the year 61 or 62 AD, about events that occurred a little over 60 years earlier. Most likely, this person he's writing to, Theophilus, was not alive at the time of these days, or if he was, he'd be a very old man now. If Theophilus was alive and old enough to remember these days himself, it's not impossible. It was about 60 years earlier, so he could have been, but he would have been in his 80s. I tend to guess he probably wasn't. My guess is that Theophilus was probably not in his 80s, and probably therefore does not have living memory of these days, but he is most likely a Roman official who probably has access to records of those days. So in those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. Now, there was a lot of debate and hullabaloo over that particular verse in the original Greek language, and whether it was the first census, or whether it's referring to the first census taken. We know this guy Quirinius from other sources, and we know that he took a census of the world, but the only one that we're aware of from other sources took place a few years later. And so there's some hullabaloo about, first, whether the first is census versus Quirinius, who knows. It's not that big of a deal. There's multiple explanations for how to fit all that together. And everyone went to his own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee, which is where he was living and where he would eventually move back to later on, to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. That's where David was from. We read about that back when we read about David in 1 Samuel. He was from Bethlehem. He went there to register with Mary. So that's how Joseph ended up in Bethlehem. Now, Matthew says he is in Bethlehem. When you read the beginning of Matthew, that's where Joseph is, and Mary and the child Jesus. And that's where the wise men go to look for him, because that's where they're told to look for him by the priests and who know about these things after they inquire of King Herod. So he's still in Bethlehem at this time. This would have been a year or two later, maybe, probably a year after Jesus was born. They're still in Bethlehem, so they stayed there for a while. They didn't come and go like within a couple of months. They stayed in Bethlehem for a while. They did eventually leave, but Matthew does not explain how they got to Bethlehem. He does explain how they went from Bethlehem down to Egypt and then back up to Nazareth, which Luke will not explain. But Luke does explain how they got to Bethlehem in the first place. See, because he was in Nazareth, Joseph lives in Nazareth, and he'll be gone from Nazareth for a few years at least, but he will eventually go back there, and most likely apparently die there. So he went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him, and who was expecting a child, so she's already pregnant by this point. And he apparently has already gotten over his concern about marrying her. We read about that in Matthew as well. Luke doesn't mention that at all. He kind of skips that. I guess he assumes that information is already available elsewhere. And he's also presenting the story from Mary's point of view, whereas Matthew presented it from Joseph's. But Joseph had a crisis of conscience when he found out that Mary was pregnant and decided to divorce her quietly and not expose her to public. He could have made a big deal about it. He could have probably had her executed. But he decided not to do that and to put her away quietly, call off the wedding. He wasn't even married to her yet. They weren't living together yet. He was going to call off the wedding and call off the whole, but he was convinced by the angel not to. That apparently has already happened. And so now they're on their way to Bethlehem. And Mary is pregnant, and apparently fairly heavily pregnant, but who knows exactly. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born. And she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. So wherever they were staying, they didn't have extra room. Now they will eventually. When the wise men come to meet them, and they're still in Bethlehem at that time, a year from now or so, they'll be living in a house. They won't be in a manger any longer. But as of now, there is not enough room. Probably because everyone's moving around, going back to their hometowns to register for this tax, this census. So there's a lot of pilgrims in need of temporary shelter, and there's not enough shelter for them all. And there were shepherds living out in the fields nearby, keeping watch over their flocks at night. And so this is nighttime. I don't know if this means the baby himself was born at night, or if he was born and then Mary put him to sleep in a manger, and then later that day, that night. It probably was the first day. I mean, this announcement to the shepherds probably did happen on the same day that Jesus was born. Whether it happened at the exact same time as Jesus, and this means that Jesus was actually born at night, I'm not sure. I don't know if we can get a sense out of that from text, but this probably was the night of the same day. We would call it the same day. They, of course, saw their days at sundown, so it may not have even been the same day according to their thinking. We saw our days in the middle of the night, so who knows. Anyway, an angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. Of course, the classic translation says, sore afraid. But the angel said to them, do not be afraid. I bring you good news of great joy that will be for all the people. Today, so this very day, in the town of David, a Savior has been born to you. He is Christ, or Messiah, the Lord. This will be a sign to you. You will find a baby wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger. These men weren't even asking for a sign. Zechariah in chapter 1 wanted a sign. He wasn't given one initially, but he wanted one. Mary didn't ask for a sign. She just didn't understand what the angel was telling her, how that'd be possible, because she never heard of a virgin giving birth before. But she didn't actually ask for a sign. These guys didn't ask for a sign either. They had no idea what was going on, but they were given a sign. The sign is going to be the baby wrapped in cloth. That's why there's a mention of the cloths in the manger. We like to think of it about the romanticism of Jesus lying in a cave somewhere with animal poop around him or something, which is possibly true. But the manger and the cloths are mentioned in the text here because they were a sign for the shepherds, that they would know which child they were looking for. Suddenly a great company of the heavenly host appeared with the angel, praising God and saying, Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace to men on whom his favor rests. When the angels had left them and gone back into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, Let's go to Bethlehem and see this thing that has happened, which the Lord has told us about. So they hurried off, and they found Mary and Joseph and the baby, who was lying in the manger, just like the angel said he would be. When they had seen him, they spread the word concerning what had been told them about this child. And all who heard it were amazed at what the shepherds said to them. But Mary treasured up all these things and pondered them in her heart. We're going to hear this mentioned again later as well. This is almost certainly an indication that Luke got this material straight from Mary. Now, Mary would have only been about 15 years old this time. If Luke is writing this material down in 61, 62 AD, Mary could very well still be alive at this time, and she'd be like in her mid to upper 70s. It's also possible that Luke heard about this from Mary at some point before this, as he was doing his research or investigating. I've said before, I believe the books of Luke and Acts were written as during Paul's imprisonment. And that lasted 4.5 years, and he spent the first 2 years of that in Caesarea, which was down in the southern part of the Promised Land. And Luke was with him the whole time. So Luke had 2 years of opportunity to wander, while Paul was in prison. Luke was not in prison. So Luke had 2 years of opportunity to wander through the land and gather evidence and information about this. And so this would have been around 60 AD, 59 AD, and it's very possible that Mary, in her mid to upper 70s at that point, would have still been alive and would have told him this stuff directly. That's assuming, of course, that Luke hadn't heard this from Mary's own mouth at some point. Yeah. Okay, what? I needed... This always have to deal with cats. Hey. So you want to know where this comes from? Well, this almost certainly comes from Mary. The shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all the things they had heard and seen, which were just as they had been told. That's enough of that. That's the Christmas story. Starting a video now.